Great. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this webinar organized by Bay Atlantic University and the Global Policy Institute here in Washington, D.C. My name is Paolo von Schirach. I serve as president of the Global Policy Institute, and I'm also honored to be faculty member, professor of political science and international relations at Bay Atlantic University. We have with us today Andrea Zanon, not a stranger to us. He's been with us in other events in the past, and he brings with his presence today his knowledge and expertise on a variety of issues, but particularly we're going to talk today about the climate change issues and everything that is related to it, including the way we're trying to adjust to it, how companies around the world are coping with this new circumstances and environment. And last but not least, also the ripple effects, the consequences of the ongoing, unfortunately, conflict in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the ripple effects that this has had on a variety of levels, from energy prices, which are also related to the topic of climate change, but also supply chain disruptions and food prices in emerging countries from Pakistan to Egypt. So all this is kind of complicated, but with Andrea's help, we hope to be able to understand this better and shed a little bit of light on these complex issues. So Andrea, first of all, welcome. Nice to see you. He's talking to us from Texas, where he's currently residing. But just tell us a little bit, okay, what this COP thing is. What are these meetings that take place periodically, and what is on the agenda, and what do you think, the value proposition of these global gatherings are?
Sure. Thank you, Paolo, and a pleasure to be back at GPI and seeing old friends. So first of all, this first webinar, I hope we can shed some lights on what is the global climate debate headed towards, what are some of these events happening. I've been referring to November as a month of sustainability because Egypt does host the COP27. COP stands for the Conference of the Parties on Climate Change. It's the 27th time countries around the world gather. This is a United Nations-led initiative that it's over 20 years old. It is an important event, and we'll also touch on the G20 summit this year because it also happens in November. That's why I said November, a month for sustainability. But let's first focus a little bit on the COP, because in a way the COP can be thought of as the roadmap, the international roadmap to reduce decarbonization, to reach the point where the carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere is harmonized by its complete removal via technology, via other means. And so let's try to better understand what these events do try to accomplish, why they're important, what are their limitations. I've myself attended 3 of them over the last 10 years. And so I'm going to try to focus both on the positive and on the limitations of these events, because and let's start maybe with the weaknesses. Being a conference organized by the United Nations, which is an important asset to have, an important pillar to have, it doesn't necessarily result into forced actions, or in other words, in these venues, we typically have deep debates about the topic, decarbonization, climate change, sustainability, investments, and the participants, which are normally heads of states, most countries participate, commit to, to actionable targets of carbon reduction, or climate change adaptation and mitigation. But again, we're talking about commitments. They're not necessarily convertible into concrete laws.
So for our audience to understand that these commitments are about reduction, right, of consumption, use of fossil fuels. Because
Correct.
The fossil fuels, everybody agrees, there is no debate, are the culprits, are those that by burning fossil fuels, be it coal, be it oil or oil-derived byproducts, be it natural gas, even though a bit less, we release into the atmosphere these greenhouse gases, which trap heat and cause, unfortunately, global warming, hence climate change. This is really the problem. And so to tackle this, we say, let's reduce consumption of fossil fuels. And I commit country X, I am France, I commit to this, and I am, I don't know, Malaysia, and I commit to that. And the question, there are two things which I think maybe you can elaborate on. One is whether or not the countries that made the commitment are somehow, how can I say, answerable. They say, oh, you committed to do this. Why didn't you do it? Well, you'll be penalized for that. Well, no such, that's not going to happen. And also, and perhaps you can really stress this point, are these targets going to make a real difference? I think that's really what's important here. In other words, if assuming that everybody does what they're supposed to do, what happens then in terms of reduction of emissions and changes in the climate?
You touched on the key points. So the COP summits aims to create the incentives for country to switch from dirty energy. We can start with coal, right? Move away from the one that causes the highest impact on the environment and the one that causes the higher level of pollutions. So sometimes we think it's a no-brainer, moving away from coal and shifting to at least natural gas, which is cleaner, or investing in renewable energy, solar, wind, hydrogen, and so forth. It's not as easy as it might sound. So you're absolutely right. It's decarbonizing means transforming your economy and making your economy more or less energy intensive, meaning that every unit of GDP, every unit of wealth that we create should use less energy, should use more clean energy. And that's where the big debate is. And we'll get later to it, what role the private sector, companies are playing, oil producers, gas producer, and so forth. On the second part, Paolo, there is one of the limitations of these summits. There is no binding. A commitment is if I exaggerate my point, it's a goodwill, right? You're committing to, and in this case, just to clarify, we're committing to reach, this is another technical term, to reach zero net, to reach zero emission by 2050, which means most countries have agreed that by 2050, have committed that by 2050, they will reach zero emission in their respective country. China and India are two, and Saudi Arabia as well, are three of the exceptions which are committed to reach that level by 2060. What does that mean, reaching that level? And what's the correlation with climate change, with disasters, and so forth? Before I go back to the commitments. This is according to the scientists, to the United Nations, and to the international community. If we hit zero net by 2050, we should stop global warming. When we stop global warming, some of the worst scenario, the worst impact on the economy that have been predicted, and now there is pretty broad agreement on the level of that impact, should be reduced. So I'm introducing another term here. We always hear climate mitigation and we hear climate adaptation. Mitigation refers to the reduction of the emissions the carbon emissions. Adaptations is what are the measures that we can do today to prevent the worst case scenario. If I'm originally from Venice, Italy. We have a lot of natural floods. So adaptation means building a water retention system, means investing in resilience, in early warning system. Mitigation means the city of Venice doing everything they can to reduce their utilization of carbon producing energy fuels. So again, reaching the zero net is that target that prevents the worst case scenario, that prevents global catastrophes. And we'll go into the numbers, the specific. How does that affect me? How does that affect my city? How does that affect my businesses? What are the numbers? Because the numbers are actually quite important. So while we have this target of 2050, that will be debated again at the COP27, which this year takes place in the Red Sea in Egypt. We go back to the point: what can the international community do to make sure that this commitment happen? And the short answer, unfortunately, it's not much. It's very difficult to say force Italy or India or China to say, if you don't comply, if you don't deliver on these commitments, we'll fine you, we'll sanction you, we'll remove you from trade agreements. That's never going to happen. There is no binding agreement. So the challenge is big. I think as we go into the webinar, we'll discuss the opportunity, how big the opportunity of decarbonization is, because I think it's equally big. And I like to, in some of my articles, I claim that decarbonization can be as big as the internet revolution of the 90s. So I think it's important to, in a way, stay away from politics, look at the opportunity and the challenge at hand, and understand what role the COP plays, what role the private sector plays, and what role the G20 plays. So why don't I stop there, Paolo?
Let me ask you, okay, so that everybody understands. As you said, if we, meaning the international community, all the countries that are gathering at all these events, including the one that's about to take place in Egypt, as you indicated in November, if they all deliver on their commitments, then we can at least stabilize the situation, right?
Right.
However, so that everybody understands, a great deal of damage has already been done. In other words, temperatures are up. There are areas of the world that are unfortunately subject to droughts or extreme weather events. We know, and we'll talk about that maybe a bit later, that there is underway a phenomenon of melting of ice in the polar caps, the North Pole, South Pole, and that is ongoing. We can certainly mitigate, meaning slow it down, but it's not going to stop it. And so certain things are already happening, and therefore they would require action, as you pointed out, which is really exciting here, the new discoveries, the new technologies for adaptation, and also whether or not it's possible to get, what do you think about, for instance, investments in green technologies? Because we know that we have them, right? We have solar, we have wind, everybody knows that. But unfortunately, maybe I would like to hear your comments. They're useful, but not extremely effective, right? They're doing okay, but not really that much okay that you can foresee a massive scaling up, that everybody's going to go solar and wind and ditch coal, gas, oil, because we're good. Talk to us a little bit about that, about the limitations of the current level of technological development and the hopes that maybe around the corner, maybe hopefully in something else and something new that may be more effective. Tell us about that.
Yeah, let me first address the damage done to date, because I think while we start on a positive footing, there are scientists that are basically referring to these tipping points, the climate tipping points, which means we've injected so much carbon dioxide and other gases into the global ecosystem that we have unsettled or damaged what we call the 9 climate tipping points systems. Think of the tropical forest, think of the barrier reef, think of the northern pole, the Arctics. What does that mean, tipping points? It means we have escalated the climate severity to a point that the intensity and frequency of natural hazards, it's often called natural disasters, are increasing. In fact, actually, over the last 20 years, the recurrence of droughts, floods, tsunamis, and severe climate-induced events have actually tripled. And with those, even the damage and losses caused by them. I'm just going to give you an example that we don't really talk enough about. So in 2020, the US, according to the national agencies, NOAA particularly, had about $20 billion natural disasters. So 20 events that each caused $1 billion in damage and losses. When I think of damages, think of buildings destroyed, think of electricity infrastructure destroyed, think of economics, economic flows interrupted. So that's 20 events, $20 billion in 2020. In 2021, to explain this escalation, these tipping points, in the state of Texas, in February, we had a cold front. A cold front, like an unexpected, really freezing in Texas, which normally doesn't experience these events. Pipes broke, heating wasn't functioning, water pumps destroyed. So the overall cost of this event was $200 billion, just this event. So why is this important? Because $200 billion is start being, we're talking roughly to 1% of the GDP of the country. We start hitting the economic well-being of countries, of families, of businesses. So this is bad news, and it's also good news in the sense that when you start hitting people's wallets, you start getting more attention and more willingness to invest in mitigation and adaptation and changes. So let me try to link to the second part of the question of Paolo, the shortcomings. What is happening in the market? What are the solutions? This is a very tough question. First of all, because on the energy side, solar and wind cannot replace carbon based fuels such as coal, gas, and oil. But they certainly should play an increasing important role. In fact,
sorry to interrupt. How explain why not? What are the limitations, the constraints in terms of energy density, as they call it in the business, right? Because people say, why not? I mean, it's great. You absorb the sun, the solar panels transform that into electricity. What's wrong with that? What is missing here?
Yeah, this will require a longer discussion, but the short answer is really solar, hydrogen, and wind are not applicable. They cannot replace a lot of the uses that oil and gas would do in the short term. There's not enough infrastructure. The investments needed to, let's say, bring solar to 50% of the global consumption are massive and require time. So again, people forget that we derive so much of the products we use every day from hydrocarbons that we will not be able to derive from solar. It includes pharmaceutical, it includes health, food products, exactly, fertilizers. So it's important to have the right debate. Solar and other are absolutely necessary and indispensable for that energy mix. You have to think that the energy mix will include many others. However, the wrong debate is when even a United Nations advocate says, no, we need to stop using oil and gas today. That's not viable. It's not going to be viable even for the next 20 years, because the transition to a greener energy-based society will require, I'll give you the number. As of right now, it will require roughly $10 to $20 trillion investment a year, which is like roughly 10 to 20% of global GDP. The world doesn't have that much money, particularly right now, to invest to replace all these infrastructure that we rely on, the power plants, the pipelines. Just to give you an example, I'm a big believer in green hydrogen, but the infrastructure for green hydrogen doesn't exist yet. And the cost of 1 pound of green hydrogen, it's like roughly 10 times of what we have available. So I think it's important to be to depoliticize the debate. I'm more realistic, and I'm also pro-green. I am in favor of green transformations, but we have to have the right debate. We have to work with the oil-producing country, gas-producing country, to make them part of the transformation process, which is actually, it's really happening. So it's not viable to think that in 5 years, we'll no longer use oil and gas. I think it's important to have a comprehensive approach where oil, gas, and renewable are moving hands in hands. What's happening in the private sector, very briefly, and then I'll give it back to you, Paolo. When we look at the investment, actually, first, let me refer to an important point here, because I talked about $10 trillion needed to invest, to become cleaner, to become zero net by 2050. That's roughly $10 trillion per year, 10% of global GDP. What is if we don't do that, because that's equally important, if we don't invest this, what is the risk of GDP losses? What is the economic potential damage if we stay like we are today? No investments. It's very severe. So by 2040, we expect that at least 10% of the global GDP could be wiped out by natural disasters. This is not me saying it. These are the global insurance. Swiss Re, Munich Re, two of the largest reinsurance players in the world, are assessing that by 2040, we'll have up to 15% of GDP vulnerable and exposed to a natural disaster, which are accelerated by climate change.
Let me just interject here, because so that everybody understands, insurance companies are really hard-nosed, observers, because this is their money, right? So they insure assets, they insure companies, and they really need to have a fairly realistic, understanding of what the risk is. And if they price it that way, it means that that's what likely going to happen. This is not a political analysis. This is a business analysis, right?
Absolutely.
So I think it's important
it's very important, Paolo. And I think this links also to what's happening in the market. And, I talk a lot to younger entrepreneurs, to startups, to people that want to look for their next job. They're in MBAs. I always tell them what's happening in the green space, in the green growth. It doesn't necessarily gets captured by the politics, by the newspaper. The investment are actually very significant. There are a lot of opportunities. I continue to argue this will be a revolution as powerful as the internet of the 90s. So let me give you a few data points here. While we both agreed on the weaknesses of the infrastructure and the limitations, particularly on the energy side, to become renewable all of a sudden, what's happening in the market? So the insurance, it's already moving, obviously. The banks, when you think of Wall Street, this is actually a very striking example. Wall Street, we refer to it as capital markets, investors, financial institutions. Over the last 2 years, what I've been doing is acquire companies that are leading climate data analysis, climate risk modeling, physical risk asset understanding, all these companies that are in the collecting the data of the future risk have been acquired by Wall Street. Why? It's very simple, because they want to price, they want to give a price to the risk. They want to become the provider of this climate risk understanding. And that's why they're spending billions of dollars. The credit ratings, same thing. They are the McKinsey, the consulting firms, same thing. They had developed sustainability unit. They've developed risk understanding units. They've created risk modeling capabilities. These, to simplify, you have to think these are the people that crunch the data to understand where they could risk losing money or where they can make money. Okay, so I think that's a big signal that the capital markets, the stock exchange, the investors believe there is a huge opportunity to make money in climate change. And there's a huge opportunity to sell the information of the understanding of how risky one investment is, how risky buying one product is. So that's number one. Number two, since I know there's also young attendees in this call, I also know that GPI and BAU University is very active with the young community. Let's look at the startup, which is an area that I'm particularly passionate about. Money into green tech, green startup, it's actually growing at a very, very fast pace. We often talk about unicorns. Unicorns are this company that reach $1 billion valuation. There are roughly 1,000 companies in that unicorn club, so to speak. We normally refer to the unicorn, you know, when a company made a $1 billion target. About 50 of these 1,000 are climate tech companies. The number is still small, it's only 5%, but what's important is the fast pace of their growth. How quickly investors are willing to put money into new climate tech companies. And also how quickly this company gets to the $1 billion valuations. In average, a unicorn takes 7 years to get there. In clean tech and climate tech, it's taking 3 to 4 years. So almost half the time. So there's great momentum in investments. And let me give you a few numbers here. We're expecting green tech investment. And obviously, green tech collects everything, right? Mobility, since electric vehicle, it's a big part of the transformations, agribusiness, food and agriculture, and energy. These are the three fastest moving sectors. By 2025, we'll have about $5 trillion invested. That's not insignificant. That's a lot of money going into startup. Why is this important? So startup are risk-taking. They're early stage company. A lot of them will fail. But what this tells you is that a lot of investors are willing to take risk and support the sustainability transformation. So that's an area that I'm particularly excited about. So we have the capital market on one end, we have the startup, the unicorns, the Silicon Valley's investments going forward, primarily led by United States and Europe, European investors. And I would say thirdly is the corporations. As I discuss, I know that I always think, how do we help people understand where the future job opportunities are, where studying at BAU will take me. So this is an interesting movement, and it actually comes out of the COP, of the climate summit. So that's why it's important to try to focus on the impactful part of them. The summit has a strong partnership with Davos, the Davos Economic Forum. The Davos Economic Forum is one of the most important, if not the most important, business economic summit that happens every year in February and May in Switzerland. It's a business focus gathering where all the the Tesla CEOs, the Amazon, the Zuckerberg, the Google, and the politicians show up to discuss business, the future trend, the risk, and so forth. So Davos created this, it's called First Coalition movement. It's a coalition of more than 50 of the top companies in the world. So think of Apple, Google, Amazon, with key governments and organizations that understand the challenge, understand that this is the investment gap, the infrastructure gap, the transition will take time. So these are 50 of the top companies in the world that are saying and by the way, they represent about $6 trillion of market capitalization. So large businesses that represent huge percentage of the global business in the world. Bill Gates is one of the key partner there as well. Because some of this new technology that Paolo refers to are still too expensive, because of some of these alternative energy like green hydrogen, green coal, even green cement are too expensive, they're committing today to buy this. This is a real commitment. It's actually an investment, not just a commitment on paper. To invest today on buying green technology and green products that are not competitive yet. They want to give a price signal to the market. We buy today so that we can help put in the money so that this company can become sustainable, profitable, and create a market. So they send a price signal that they believe in this product will be the future. So again, just to recap briefly, and then I'll hand it over to you. The capital markets, the stock exchange, are buying all companies that have data on the future risk because there is a huge money opportunity to sell that service and also understand where the risks are. Insurance is doing the same thing. So capital markets. Second, startup. The startup are receiving faster than anybody else investments in the area of green tech, clean tech, because the investor believe there is a huge market opportunity. And hence they're joining the unicorn club very, very fast, faster than anybody else. And third, 50 plus of the largest corporations are investing massively in these green tech solutions and these green product solutions, which are not competitive yet, and they are putting in money to make them competitive going forward. A last point on the investment, Paolo. By 2022 or 2023, we expect that $1 in $3 invested will have a component of sustainability. 1 out of 3. That's roughly $50 trillion. So you have to think that 1 out of 3 investor in the world believes that we need to have a level of sustainability, social inclusion, and innovation involved that is good for the environment. So I think these are 3 powerful market signals.
I mean, you described a pretty big shift, obviously, in the orientation of investors, capital markets, big corporates, all these initiatives. Of course, and also you pointed out a caveat before when you said there are all these startups, warning, many startups fail, right? We know that. That happens in every business. It's not about green tech, it's about everything. And this is also for our students here. Yes, be aware, in fact, probably most startups fail. If you think about it, that doesn't mean we stop trying. And many successful startups are led by people who had 2 or 3, maybe other tries and failed, and then eventually they figured out the right model, the right structure, and they do something that really works. So one shouldn't be discouraged by looking, oh my God, nothing is a sure thing, especially when you are exploring new fields. But I wanted to, if I may, just to also get back to something that we know that is fairly known industry and quantity, but is so controversial. that at the moment is not making inroads. And I'm referring here to nuclear power. Nuclear power is by definition clean energy, right? Because it has zero emissions. However, there is the concern, as everybody knows, about safety. I think, we're old enough to remember, 3 Mile Island, here in the United States. It was many years ago, but this was in Pennsylvania, not far from Washington, when there was a failure and the fear of obviously the nuclear power plant, that there would be radiation, released into the atmosphere. Luckily, nothing happened, but it was a big scare. Then, of course, Chernobyl. Everybody knows, or at least should know, about Chernobyl. It was a very old Soviet-designed, reactor in Ukraine, as it were, and that was a big disaster. I mean, it wasn't a catastrophe, but close enough. I mean, because many people died, many people were affected by radiation. The radiation spread around Europe, really went very far. And then last but not least, we got Fukushima Daiichi in Japan a few years ago, in which, because of a natural event, a tsunami, basically a reactor built near the coastline, and God knows why they did that. The water coming in flooded their pumps, and not get too technical, but that was another disaster. I don't believe anybody died there, but the damage was significant. There were massive evacuations, and they're still trying to fix it as we speak. That led to, oh my God, nuclear power is terrible and we shouldn't do it. Germany, knee-jerk reaction at the time, said, we're going to shut down all our reactors after the accident in Japan. My point here, just to be brief, is here in the United States, for better or worse, we still rely on about 20%, roughly, of our electricity generation, which is quite a lot, on nuclear power. On the other hand, we're not building any new nuclear power plants, and hardly any, because of the concerns, because people don't want them. Say, oh, we're going to build a nice nuclear power reactor right next to you in your community in Connecticut, or I don't know, Oklahoma, wherever. People say, no, thank you very much, somewhere else, not here. And so, and by the way, also because of the need to make these new plants super safe with double hull, triple hull, whatever that is, and creating all sorts of redundancies, the costs have gone through the roof. And so we don't even know whether this is, quite frankly, practical. However, and here's my question finally, there's a lot of debate, and maybe you want to shed some light on this, about these new technologies, about small nuclear reactors. You mentioned Bill Gates. He's invested in at least one startup that where he put his own money into it, that supposedly can, how can I say, address the issues of both safety and scalability. Because of being small, they can be manufactured in pieces in factories and then delivered on the site instead of having the whole thing done from scratch. Because of all these problems and the fact that this small nuclear reactors technology is still experimental at this point, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of investments, a lot of companies involved in the US, in Japan, in Europe. Do you see that as a potential answer to our efforts of decarbonization, or the resistance, political, psychological, whatever that is still so strong? And of course, the issue of nuclear waste disposal, what are we going to do with it? And God forbid, we've seen it now in the war in Ukraine, where nuclear power reactors are being targeted, or kind of semi-targeted, by the Russians. I mean, are the risks all included where it can be, cost too high, risk of radiation release, natural disaster? Is that, in other words, is this viable, or is this just another thing that is not going to happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. Tough questions, Paolo. I always argue for an energy mix approach. So when you think of energy mix, you have to have all options. And in some country, nuclear is more viable than others. I I think I'm pro-nuclear, and I believe that nuclear, particularly since you referred to Russia, and when you have energy shocks like we are experiencing right now, particularly in Europe, then energy security, national energy security becomes even more important. How do I rely on pipelines or on shipping lanes? So I think we go back to the element of crisis, and what I always say, I think crises are incredible opportunities. Let's not waste a good crisis, in the sense that if you think through nuclear, even if you are Germany or Japan, you want to learn from the Fukushima. I actually visited Fukushima myself after the tsunami. You visit the sites, you understand the challenges, you learn from the mistake, and design the future for energy security, including nuclear, absorbing the cost because it's actually considerable, but knowing that you're paying a premium in cost because you're also buying energy security and reliability of supply, which, as you know, in many European countries, that's, as we go toward the winter, that's gone. It's gone because of the conflict. It's gone because of the sabotage to the pipelines. It's gone because Nord Stream 2 will never come to market, potentially. So I think it's important always to, of course, look at the economics and the affordability, because these are long-term investments when we talk nuclear. Look at the waste management security aspect, because that's, the technology is not 100% yet. But I think equally important to think of a multi energy supply source. You have to think that to guarantee energy security, business continuity, and just life in general, you cannot over rely on one source. You cannot, and you certainly cannot do that if you want to decarbonize your economy. So you cannot rely on a single source. If you're in West Virginia, you have abundant coal, but that's no longer competitive. We can't fade it out immediately, but we have to start working toward that, because the market doesn't want it. I'm just going to give you an example of what's happening in West Virginia in terms of some of the endowments, some of the schools, some of the investor. They're divesting from any company that is exposed to the coal market. So the truth is, we got to follow the money. We got to stay flexible, understand that we have a climate risk that can be converted into an opportunity. And so I see nuclear having a role, but probably not in Europe in the short term, because I see the political resistance being too severe. And I do think that it could play a role in other emerging economies and potentially even in the US, in spite of the cost. But I think we are at a transition point where the investment that is betting on the green revolution, it's massive. We cannot ignore it. So that's why I keep the dialogue away of the politics. Look at what the private sector is doing. Look at what the entrepreneurs are doing, even those that fail, but they're taking risk because the opportunity is being defined and the shift, it's happened.
We have a question from our students. This is Telman, who is asking you, Andrea, when we say tackling climate change, how would you solve the problem of the free riders? Some countries seem to commit to climate change measures, but not all. How do countries prioritize problems when the country itself is in deep poverty or civil war? In other words, how do you, you alluded to that earlier, but perhaps you want to elaborate further so that everybody here understands the complexity of all this.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much. Tough question. I've worked for a long time in developing countries in Africa and the Middle East, so I'm very familiar with the Middle East. And the first thing that comes to mind is what South Africa has been trying to do, because it's actually tough to impose to the rest of the world, or to understand why we're imposing everybody needs now to use renewable. While the biggest polluter is the US, Europe, and China. Why does South Africa have to commit to the same targets when the percentage of emissions are much lower on the per capita basis, or also on the national scale. You know, there's no easy answer to that one. But I want to talk briefly about what South Africa has done. South Africa is committed to remove all the coal usage to generate electricity. And it's engaged.
So let's explain to everybody that South Africa is a major coal producer.
Absolutely. So
There's
South Africa, Australia, very, very large player in the coal exporting market, also in the generating their energy from coal. So part of South Africa commitment to say, yes, I want to decarbonize my economy. I want to become more efficient, more green, create new jobs. So South Africa is one of these countries that has been very active in Davos, very active at this coalition of investors, and has basically managed to convince international investors. And so I'm giving you this example because that's what government and the private sector should think about. They've convinced international donors and investors to say, okay, we move to a greener energy, but you invest, you come into our country, we'll give you incentives to help us transition so that the South African people don't pay for it. It's the international community to pay for it. So South Africa secured significant investments to start shifting to this transition. They've done that by lobbying, by advocating their openness for business, opening up to foreign investments. And so you have to have that ability and willingness to try and to go into the capital market, say, yes, we give away part of the control of the companies we control before, we let American, British investor come in, but you have to pay for this transition, right? So let me be even more specific. The international community committed to help, particularly you alluded to the vulnerable countries, the violent crisis-prone countries. They've committed $100 billion per year for these countries. This is actually in grants and investments to help transition them. This is not happening very fast. In part, it's also because the recipient countries are not being as proactive in a way as South Africa. So I think, you know, again, it takes two to tango here. You have to think through new coalitions because the poor country, the underdeveloped countries will never be able to pay for it. So you have to think creatively. You have to open your economy to investments. You have to go at Davos and talk to the private sector and try to create that space for investments. Otherwise, there's no way the South African or the Egyptian, and I'm linking to the Egyptian to make concrete examples, can pay themselves through taxations toward this transformation. So think of Egypt now. Egypt in November will host COP 27, the climate summit number 27. The Egyptian leadership are trying to position themselves as the Middle Eastern country that is doing the most to promote investment in green growth. Why are they doing it? They're doing it to attract investment in 3 of their key sectors, which will help create jobs, grow their national income, and expand their economies. Agriculture. Egypt is a massive agriculture producer. Tourism. That's another area where Egypt is promoting the future of tourism, more sustainable tourism, more efficient deployment of energy. So you have to think that these events, and by the way, I'll talk in a little bit about the World Cup, the soccer World Cup that also happens in November, because there's an element of sustainability there. But think of some of these events as a branding opportunity. Egypt has an opportunity to tell the world, we're gathering here today because we're transforming our economy. We have 50% of the population is under 30. We want to create the job of the future. We want to invest in startup of the future. We want to have only electric vehicle in the future. We want to have an agriculture that is completely green. They use a satellite to monitor drought and have efficient irrigation system powered by solar, et cetera, et cetera.
Sorry, if I may interrupt, because I see that unfortunately time is upon us and we don't have a lot left. Why don't we use the rest of the time allocated for us for you to give us a few examples, Andrea, of companies that you know, some of which you work with, but others that you learn about, that are in this kind of a general universe of adaptation technologies, so that everybody can understand. Please correct me if I'm wrong. These are not just necessarily energy companies, right? But anybody who is investing or looking into ways to improve resilience. You just mentioned agriculture, or water. We know in Israel, for instance, they're very good. They've perfected or improved desalination technology, right? Water scarcity is a huge problem around the world, particularly in Africa, that you and I both know quite well. So getting water, affordable water, if water is no longer coming from rivers or lakes or whatever because of all these climate disruptions, you need water. You need more efficient ways to have agriculture, irrigation.
Absolutely.
So give us maybe one or two examples of companies that you know about or whatever. Say, okay, these guys are, whether they are operating, I don't know, it could be, as you said, satellite imaging to have real-time information and intelligence about what's happening in the atmosphere, but it could be about improving water or irrigation or new type of seeds, for particular crops that are more drought resilient or that are more pest resilient. Tell us about some of that.
Yeah, and Paolo, I'll start with the sectors more than even the individual companies, because you have to assume that the biggest companies are the one leading the market. So think of Tesla, think of Apple, think of Google, but I'll try to also go on the startup. Think of, some of the Saudis company are the leaders in green tech because they come from the energy. But let me tell you what other sectors, in my view, that are creating the fastest and even the more exciting opportunity. I would say I pointed out at it at the beginning, and maybe over a next webinar we can drill down specific on this. But everything that has to do with risk understanding, climate risk, data management, that's where the value, no matter what sector you end up working, if you can become a better practitioner, expert in climate risk data, you'll have a job, you have a company, because you can sell this understanding, this modeling.
Yes.
That is very powerful. That's why when I said Wall Street basically every company out there that is doing this job. One, it is important to, I used to actually work with them. It's called RMS. I think it's risk management system. It's been acquired by the Dow Jones for a few $1 billion. So they basically are the one-stop shop to give you risk understanding. For example, let's say you want to start a business in South Africa or in Saudi or in Italy. How much does it cost me from the climate perspective? What is the risk exposed myself to disasters and so forth? So that's a big one, and it's quite technical. So these very engineering, very data-driven companies. Another one that is obviously the one that is receiving most money, it's electric vehicles. So anything related to the batteries for electric vehicles for the future is going to be massive. It's already massive. So that's why we typically refer to the mobility sector. Anything that has to do with mobility, from the hardware, software, even tracking it. There's a lot of big data companies now looking at tracking the movement of all this vehicle and what the future of transportation will look like is it's an exciting one. Again, technical background, very engineering focused, very energy based, and you will see an integration of the sector where the mining for lithium and the production of cars ends up being in the same country, to exaggerate my point. A few other sectors where generalists will have more opportunities, where I think there's a huge need for marketing people, sales, business development, communications, which are sectors that we cover also when you're in business school. I would say the agribusiness, it's a big one. Anything from the future of food, the distribution of food, the supply, the labeling of food, for example, anything that is related to smart labeling, which can help us trace the compliance of the entire supply chain, which means where did I buy this rice from? Was it produced according to norms? Was it climate resilient, meaning did I use a lot of water or did I use enough water? That smart labeling, it's actually an industry that's receiving a lot of investments because they haven't done enough. You have to think through this lens. Today, there's a lot of climate food companies starting. Imagine, I'll give you an example that connects with the whole discussion. Italy is one of the largest producer of a type of rice that we use at sushi bar. People don't know this, but Italy is going through a drought right now, massive. 30% of the production of this rice is down, which is going to cost international consumer a lot more to eating sushi or buying Italian rice. Now, the question is, why am I producing rice in a country that doesn't have enough water? Maybe there's an opportunity to figure out how to produce rice with less water or produce rice where there is water. That's also an opportunity. So that's also decarbonization. It's moving where the resources are abundant, not where they're scarce.
Yeah.
Another sector. Yeah, Paolo, jump in, please.
Jump in quickly, because we have another question here from our audience, which is a bit, cutting right at the heart of everything. The questioner says, what do you say to those who say ESG is a fad, meaning it's not real, it's just something you do to go through the motions and because you want to look good or what have you, and brush up your credentials, and it's not really meaningful? Since this is something you know,
it's a great question.
Fairly well, maybe you want to address that.
Yeah.
Probably that would have to be the end of our meeting today.
Absolutely.
So what do you say to ESG fad, question mark?
Great question. Let me add to the previous question. Fashion is another sector ready to be disrupted by all the climate revolution, because it's very old school, very energy intensive. So if you're interested in the fashion industry, that's being transformed because of required transparency, particularly supply chain. ESG a fad. Look, I think the short answer is ESG is the necessary evil. I don't agree with many of the ESG checking the box approach, disclosing, having an annual report.
Just please spell out what ESG is for everybody.
Yes, thank you, Paolo. ESG is a new sort of movement that encapsulates everything around sustainability, social inclusion, etc. It stands for environmental, social, and governance. It's a label that basically will require businesses to disclose their climate footprint. What score do you have? Are you using clean sources? Are you treating the environment poorly? A score 60 and up would be a good score to have. S, social. How to simplify? Are you part of? Are you solving social problem? Are you inclusive? Do you include women's in your board? Do you have safety at work, etc. And the governance side is really, how do you structure your board? Is the decision-making process transparent? Is there a balance of skill set and genders and ethnicity? So these are all societal problems then that the politics are now pushing to the finish line. I don't think it's a fad. I also come from the capital markets, and it's a pain. It's difficult to deal with it. But I think it's the result of a long-term neglect. We have not done our job at describing our impact on the environment, on integrating social problems in our business model to ensure that we have more balanced team and that we are addressing inclusiveness issues. So that we don't have balanced salaries across the board. So I think when the politics pushes for ESG, I see the market having free ride for too long on way too advantageous policies that allow for massive pollutions, inefficiency, discriminations, and so forth. So I think we are moving toward a standardization of ESG, a more mature ESG, but for the time being, I think it's a necessary evil where the regulator is going to impose the private sector to be more compliant, to be more transparent, and to help address some of the social challenges. So to wrap up, I think ESG represents a significant business opportunity. We should not jump ship and think that everything has to be ESG, but I think there is a massive sustainability movement that will completely change the way we do business. My last point, the consumers, and I connect it to the crisis, the multiple year of crisis have done a lot of damage to the mental health, to the economies, to the households. The consumers will be watching what the business does more and more. So I think the shift is happening, not because the politics say ESG is right, but also because the consumer and the community want to have a say, want to know where the product comes from, and want to have, they believe that sustainable environments is the future, and we cannot let the markets and the companies, proceed without any level of regulation. So I do believe is a necessary evil.
That's a very good note, and I think I hope that every person with a little bit of common sense would say that whatever we do economically, which is the effort to produce wealth and to produce goods and services that respond to needs of consumers, that this is not done at the cost of destroying our planet, which is the only one we've got. We don't have a spare one that we can call into service if we completely destroy the one we have. Thank you, Andrea, very much. There's a lot we left out because we had a pretty packed agenda, but I think we're kind of scratching the surface here in a very good way, thanks to your help. And I hope this was useful for our audience, particularly for our BAU students, that I think especially those of you who are studying, those of you studying, politics and international affairs, definitely, but also those of you who are studying business and who are thinking about a future for yourselves as entrepreneurs, whatever country you'll end up in. I mean, these are exciting new vistas that are opening up, as Andrea explained to us. And again, there's a lot more, and hopefully stay tuned. We'll continue the conversation. But with that, I would like to thank Andrea for joining us and giving us his insights. I thank everybody for attending. I thank my colleagues, Denise and Brendan, who've been instrumental in organizing this and other events. So on behalf of the Global Policy Institute and Bay Atlantic University, many thanks, and we're done for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. It was a pleasure being here. Have a great day.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, everyone.